and I want to introduce our speakers today. We have three very special speakers, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about who we have today. All right. Our first speaker, actually, we're waiting for him to join us, but I'm going to introduce him and then reintroduce him, probably, is Larry Hirahara. Larry was born and raised in a small family farm in Madera, California. After graduating from Cal Poly in San Luis Obispo, he had a 40-year career in the Salinas Valley, mainly in the vegetable seed trade and also in the produce industry and irrigation industry. And he's currently living and working at the family farm in Madera. We have Al Bagua, a second-generation resident of Monterey County and a Salinas native. Al is past president of the Monterey County Historical Society, and he currently serves on the board of directors there. He is the past president of the Filipino American National Historical Society. He received his bachelor's degree from San Jose State and his master's degree from Golden Gate University. And so happy to have Al here today. And he was employed also by the Monterey County Department for Probation, or Probation Department, for 32 years. Finally, we have Dr. Robina Bhatti. Dr. Bhatti was born and raised in Karachi, Pakistan. She is an academic and activist, and she's an organic farmer. She's a professor of global studies at Cal State Monterey Bay and has been teaching there for 25 years, over 25 years. Her class on global ecology led to organic farming, and she is now in her 6th year of farming. I want to learn more about that, Robina. She engages in agricultural practices drawing on her Punjabi farming heritage, and she helps weave together academics, activism, and love of land. Her farm is named Robina's Organics, and it specializes in organic vegetables, and in 2020, saffron was its newest addition. That's so exciting. Want to hear about that later as well. So we have our program. The order of it is that we have Larry first, and then we have Al, and then we have Robina. Welcome, Larry. All right. So Larry, I actually introduced you a little bit earlier as well. So if you're ready to go, we can go in the order. And Larry, you can take it away.
So what does my background have to do with my knowledge of Asian agricultural history other than being Japanese? Well, as a leader of the Buddhist Temple of Salinas, I became involved with Chinatown revitalization. The temple was located near Salinas Chinatown, which many California Buddhist temples are. As a part of revitalization, there was a desire to preserve Asian culture and history of Chinatown. I was a founding member of Asian Cultural Experience, ACE, whose mission I just stated. A consultant came to address how to preserve the story of Asians in Chinatown. He suggested that an intertwining theme needed to be identified to bring the story together. That theme was determined to be agriculture and the immigrant story. Agriculture was the predominant business in the beginning of Salinas, and the need for cheap labor was especially important. So there's a shot of my blueberries. I'm Blueberry Larry. But the twists and turns of and the eventual outcome of this immigrant story are directly related to agriculture and Asians. I will attempt to tell the agricultural history of immigration, barriers to them, and innovation of Asians, especially Japanese, in agriculture. My involvement in ACE and historic and cultural preservation, through my involvement, I was able to learn the history of Chinese, Japanese, and Filipino immigrants. And at the end, I will briefly discuss those ag production skills necessarily that were integrated in today's modern commercial fertilizer. Early agriculture began with mission days producing food for the mission. Later, dry land farming was developed for grain. Mission San Antonio was innovative in the time because they developed canals to transport water, which was one of the first irrigation systems in California. In 1896, Klaus Spreckels came to the Salinas Valley to establish the largest sugar beet refinery in the world. Growing sugar beets required much labor, so Klaus Spreckels is considered the precursor to intensive agriculture in Salinas Valley, and his place in history is ambivalent. I want to talk about immigration history first before tying it back to agriculture. The Chinese were first to arrive in the Salinas Valley. They migrated from two locations in California after the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad and the end of the gold rush. That would be 1870. Mainly men, many were merchants, houseboys, or cooks. The Chinese were significant in agriculture because they were the ones that dug the gravity flow ditch, that drainage ditch that still works and exists today in Salinas. They helped Spreckels build his own railroad and made deal with landowners in the Blanco district to clear land. The Blanco area in Salinas has very heavy clay soils and do not drain well, and were covered with willows. The Chinese were given a 5-year lease to use the land, but had to clear the willows and establish drainage. Even at a no rent cost, after clearing the land, the tenant usually had only 1 or 2 years to try to grow a cash crop to recoup his labor before giving back the land. The Chinese also worked in sugar beet fields, but most were not farmers. The 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act ended Chinese immigration. The Chinese, who were already here, were allowed to stay, but were a dwindling source of cheap labor. The need for a new source of cheap labor created an opportunity for people in Japan who were experiencing economic and political pressure to immigrate. Immigrants from Japan were issued passports by the government of Japan. Immigrants from Japan labor contractors from Salinas came recruiting laborers, promising work. When they arrived, the labor contractors had boarding houses that housed and fed them in, somewhat similar to H2A today. In Salinas, there was racial bias, so the Japanese boarders ended up living next to the Chinese in, quote, Chinatowns, as that was the only place they were allowed to stay. Some fields, but the plantation life was not desirable, and they heard about Spreckels and traveled to Salinas to find better work. Sugar beets was very labor intensive, but seasonal. The Japanese immigrants were very entrepreneurial, so they became ancillary businesses such as trucking and growing vegetables and beets as sharecroppers. The 1907-08 Gentlemen's Agreement was established between Japan and the United States, which stopped the issuance of passports by Japan to the United States, effectively ending immigration. The agreement did allow wives to receive passports, that wives were in Japan to receive passports and immigrate. This exception created the phenomenon of picture brides. Resident Japanese men would arrange for a trusted family friend to arrange a marriage, and their only contact would be by exchanging pictures. This thus circumventing the gentleman's agreement. Although most arrangements worked, this was a unique time and place in history. Thus, early Japanese immigrants became families and working units. The California Alien Land Law of 1913 barred aliens, but mainly Japanese from owning or leasing land. In 1924, the California Exclusion Act barred Japanese entirely. The 1942 Executive Order 9066, incarceration of Japanese aliens and Japanese American citizens during World War II. It's created an even greater need for farm labor. According to the Buddhist Temple of Salinas, there were over 300 families as members that's families, not individuals, before the war, and only 50 families returned after the war. The Tanamura families, partners in TNA, lost everything during the war. They came back, started over, and achieved all their success after that. With the Chinese and Japanese exclusion acts, along with the unavailability of cheap labor, other sources were sought. Al Baggio will speak about the Filipino experience. The early Japanese immigrants were mainly farmers in Japan, and that became their niche in the Salinas Valley agriculture. First as sharecroppers, or leasing land in hopes and aspirations of eventually owning the land. From their experience and farming skills, they became successful farmers. This knowledge was passed on through generations about the holistic approach of viewing and understanding plant growth. The adaptation of Japanese farmers to integrate how low nitrogen products like manures and irrigation techniques like precision for irrigation allowed them great success growing fruits and vegetables. Probably no crop demonstrates that these attributes greater than strawberries. The need for small amounts of nitrogen throughout the growing season, roots that are very sensitive to overwatering, and farming on hilly terrain created many challenges that required constant oversight. So they had to farm sandy ground, which created frequent irrigations, but not too much, as the plants would suffer. So first, they were irrigators with short runs to control the moisture. And if the sandy soil happened to be on hilly ground, then terrace furrows were required. Many times they were in fields that were not that many regular row crop farmers did not want, so they had to adjust for these poor conditions. This created a 24/7 requirement to have a successful crop. Knowing how much manure and additive fertilizer was also an expertise they acquired through constant observation and experimentation. But this is only part of the growing equation. So what was the model used to grow and harvest strawberries? For those unknown to sharecropping, in that era, it was a term that meant a landowner would have a person, usually a family, grow a crop on his land with the family supplying the labor to grow and harvest the crop. Usually all inputs were provided by the landowner and the family supplied the labor of growing and harvesting. At the end of the season, they would each get an agreed upon share of the crop's profits. Strawberries generally are split half and half. The picture shows a 200-acre berry farm in 1924. It had a master lease by the Yamamoto family, and they organized 40 Japanese families to sharecrop their own plots. So it's obvious, there was always benefit of having a large family. But they had to go the crop, and if unsuccessful growing, they had poor harvest and return. The harvest was most labor intensive, so much of their own input was required. The cooperation and organizational skills required for sharecropping was a daunting task, but the Japanese remained the predominant strawberry growers well into the 70s. Currently, they remain in the industry, but a small percentage growing. The emergent strawberry growers are Hispanic. This illustrates the immigrant story of who is willing to sacrifice the 24/7 attention that the crop requires. The current business model is modified sharecropping. Much of the lettuce grown before World War II was done by Japanese growers. I ended the Japanese story with World War II and does not include the second wave of Japanese immigrant that developed the cut flower industry after the war. Pre-war fertilization practices for vegetables were limited to high salt N sources, manures, and limited potassium sources. Much of the Salinas Valley vegetable ground was basically high levels of nutrition, but poorly drained. So salt buildup and overwatering could be a problem. So cultural practices like ground prep, soil aeration, and managing nutrients level were critical. A Nisei friend of mine who has since passed, Harry Sumida, told me that before commercial fertilizers became available and economical, that Japanese growers of lettuce were successful because they had to manage irrigation. That was the only variable that the grower had control over. Production of ammonium nitrate had been around for a long time, but it was relatively expensive to produce. During World War II, Germany and the United States ramped up ammonium nitrate production as a part of explosives for their war machines. At the end of the war, there was inventory and excess production capacity of ammonium nitrate. How to utilize it became a simple task of formulating commercial fertilizer along with natural holdings of rock phosphate and potassium for the era of commercial fertilizer to begin. This quick release fertilizer created growing techniques that encouraged overuse and penalized underuse. Much of the seed breeding and variety development focused on this readily available input. I am not saying today's growers using commercial fertilizer have less skill, but that without it, a more intense, different skill set was required. Are the good old days better? Hardly, since we currently have the most productive agricultural system ever. But the integration of previous experience and skills helped to create the productive system we enjoy today. But we as growers can learn and appreciate from what was required in the past. In the end, I try to tell the contributions of Asian in Salinas Valley agriculture, which is also an immigrant story, whose history we need to be informed and remember. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Larry. That was excellent, really fantastic. I learned so much. We're going to go into a mini question and answer right now, and I will start off the first question by asking, what motivates you to continue your work in terms of telling the stories and also gathering the history of Asians' contributions in agriculture? We talked about agriculture as the framing of it, but you mentioned it's really an immigrant story. So what motivates you, and what are you hoping to do with all this in the end, or what impact are you hoping to have?
Well, currently we're working on a project to convert a old chop suey Chinese restaurant in Chinatown into a cultural historic museum. And it's an opportunity to tell this story themed on agriculture, why these immigrant groups came to the Salinas Valley. And from these immigrant stories, then you can learn that it's going to be, no doubt, be true for other immigrants, that their success will be have some challenges, but also the success will be hopefully evident.
Are there any other questions?
Larry, I'd love to ask a question. My family farmed in the Salinas Valley. They're Japanese American immigrants, and they had 2 generations that lived and farmed in Salinas, and they lost their farm after forced imprisonment of World War II. And I just wonder if you could speak for a moment about sort of the aftermath of the internment camps and the impact on specifically Japanese American farmers, and maybe relate that a little bit to what happened in your own family.
Well, there's 2 parts of that. First is many people were greatly impacted by the incarceration, and many lost many things. As you can tell by the story, that only 50 families returned of 300 that were originally there. There was a lot of anti-Asian sentiment, and also part of that history is there was a National Guard tank group from Salinas that went to the Philippines that had ended up being a part of the Bataan Death March. So there was increased animosity toward Japanese returning, and they actually had a survey that ran through the city of Salinas, and only one person that said that they should return. So there was very hard feelings. On the other side, on a personal note, you know, I live in a 3-generation family household, but my father was fortunate that he had a lawyer that he gave power of attorney to. He had a loyal friend that took care of the ranch, and actually, because prices were so good during World War II, when he came back, they were able to buy the ranch. They were able to buy the ranch, so they didn't suffer the consequences that a lot of people had, and they were very fortunate in that regard.
Larry, a question here is that, do you see any commonalities? Like there's various racial ethnic groups. You know, we had also Robina on the panel, and then we had Al as well, who talked a little bit about the contributions of Filipinos in farming in the Salinas Valley. But do you see what are some of the common themes that you're seeing in this immigrant story across the board again?
I'd say that in spite of the challenges, all these ethnic groups, in spite of the challenges, in spite of the discrimination, that they were able to, you know, they persevered. I guess that's maybe the main question is perseverance, and continue to strive for success. And so that can be a story that I think is told continuously, and hopefully when history looks back on California agricultural history, I'm sure that they'll see that that we can't begin to be successful without the current Hispanic immigrant population.
Before we go, could you share a few resources for people who might want to learn more about this or get involved with some of the projects that you mentioned?
Hello, this is Elizabeth Gas from the electric company, calling to let you know that your safety is our
Probably
priority.
hallmark was I've never been in your building. This is the Chinese going to the Buddhist temple, and even the Buddhist temple members had never been in the Confucius Church or the Filipino Center. So those walls coming down probably were hopefully one of the greatest benefits of the Asian Festival. But our goal is to educate the people of Salinas what revitalization is, and also what that there is a active Asian community. I suspect that if you polled the majority of the Salinas people, probably 60% of them don't know that there's a Chinatown in Salinas. It has some negative attributes as far as maybe at this time a homeless encampment, kind of a blighted neighborhood, but at one time it was a very vibrant community.
Well, thank you, Larry. It's been great to hear your story and all of the work you've done to preserve this history and share it with the agricultural community and the public at large. We're very grateful for the work you've done.
We're going to hear from Al today. He's going to talk about the history of Filipinos farming in the Salinas Valley.
Okay, could everybody hear me? First and foremost, I want to say that let everybody know that my dad immigrated in 1923 and settled in Salinas, California. He worked in the fields all his life, mostly as an irrigator. I myself worked in the fields during the summers of high school and 1 year of college at Hartnell. I worked harvesting vegetables. The worst job was thinning lettuce. we used the infamous short hoe, which gave many field workers back problems. Through the efforts of the United Farm Workers, the short hoe was deemed illegal and is no longer in use. In my presentation, I will attempt to address the following two issues: the impact and contributions the Filipinos made to the Salinas Valley agricultural industry.
Hi, Mr. Hirahara. This is Molly Nakahara.
Oh, it's okay. Keep going. Keep going. You can keep going.
And the discrimination faced by Filipino farm laborers that led to the Wansonville race riots in the early 1930s. At the end of the Spanish-American War in 1898, the United States acquired territories of Guam, Puerto Rico, part of Cuba, and the Philippine Islands. Filipinos then were considered American nationals. Now, during the 1900s through 1935, Filipinos who were American nationals were free to enter the United States as long as they had the price of a boat ticket. Filipinos who immigrated to the United States came from practically every island in the Philippines. My father came from a very small island of Siquijor in the southern Philippines. There were few jobs to be had on the island. Most of the population survived on vegetables that they grew and farm animals raised on what little land they owned or rented. The barter system was used among the island people because of the scarcity of money. Like many young Filipinos who were faced with chronic poverty, my father, Casiano Baguio, ran away from home and went to the larger neighboring island of Cebu. He worked cleaning fish on the docks of Dumaguete, a port city on the island of Cebu. He worked for different fishermen, earning $1 work. He was 12 years old, and at one time, his cousin Leandro Baguio joined him in Dumaguete. Now, one day, a huge passenger ship arrived in Dumaguete. On board were about 100 sacadas. Sacadas were young Filipino men, mostly from the countryside barrios. They were unskilled, uneducated, and unsophisticated laborers, but possessed a determination to seek a better life for themselves. The combination of lures and enticements from the pineapple, the sugarcane agricultural business complex in Hawaii and California, along with the labor situation in the Philippines, made this opportunity too good to pass up. Hawaii then became a stepping stone for many Filipinos who eventually settled in California and notably in the Salinas Valley, becoming a major supply of labor for the Monterey County agricultural industry. They worked the fields from the Pajaro River to the north and the southern border of the county south of King City from 1920s through 1960s. Like many immigrants who came to this country, they were seeking a better way of life. The first wave of Filipino workers to arrive in the Salinas Valley found working conditions to be very poor, and just as they had in Hawaii. They worked long hours for wages that ranged from 15 cents an hour to $1 an hour. Living conditions were difficult. Most camp buildings were composed of wooden tar paper shacks, similar to the Filipino labor camp building put on display at the Monterey County Historical Society in the Baranda area. This building was to replicate past living conditions that the Filipinos had to endure. This was accomplished with the support of the Filipino American National Historical Society. And after working all day, the men were housed into the bunk beds to rest until morning. A quote from Manuel Cabreras, a laborer in Salinas Valley in 1927, stated, $2.75 a day, 10 hours at a time. It's hardly daylight when we moved to the fields and came back after sundown. It was hard. At night, I felt all kinds of pain in my body and my back and my arm. Imagine, less than 15 years old, after I got to bed, I'd be crying. Racial tensions were at their peak during the 1930s. Judge Rohrabaugh of Santa Cruz County proposed a resolution condemning the Filipinos of northern Monterey County because they were a health and social menace. This resolution added to the xenophobia rising in the Pajaro Valley, setting the stage for the Watsonville riot in January of 1930. It became highly publicized, and prolonged period of violence was directed at the Filipino farm workers. In early January, the Evening Pajaronian published the entire interview with Judge Rohrabaugh and stressed that racial antipathy toward immigrant Filipinos had reached a new heights in California. It was a highly charged atmosphere. Filipino owned a nightclub, opened a nightclub in Palm Beach. Palm Beach was an area a few miles outside the city of Watsonville. It became a gathering place and a dance hall for Filipino working men. The Pajaronian newspaper, in their editorial, condemned this hall, this taxi dance hall, and the use of white men as drinking and dancing partners of Filipinos. On January 22nd, 1930, a mob of about 500 local white youths and adults, primarily blue-collar workers, marched upon the Palm Beach dance hall. The vigilantes attacked the club. Herman Tabero was killed while he was sleeping at the nightclub. Local law enforcement escorted Filipinos caught in the melee amidst taunts and jeers of street mobs. An investigation determined that Tabero was killed by a youthful white gang member who left his shoe at the scene. There was a jury trial, and the defendant was found guilty and sentenced to prison by the court. The sentence, however, was suspended, and the community did nothing to establish justice for the killing of Mr. Tabero. The Filipino community of Wattsville and Salinas arranged for Tabero's body to be sent to the Philippines, where the day of national mourning was declared and observed. Throughout the U.S. agricultural lands from Los Angeles to Washington State, Filipinos were subjected to racial prejudice and violence, and the chief factors that prompted the Watsonville riots applied to all areas where Filipinos would face racial hostility. They were: Filipinos had simplistic living standards and willing to work for less pay, leading to crowding out whites from the labor market. In reality, displacement was not high. The Watsonville lettuce industry was built entirely on Filipino stoop labor. Physical and cultural Filipino, an easy target for white prejudice. The population imbalance, the Filipino force was composed of men who aided as youths and young unmarried men. At the conflict, 93 out of 100 Filipinos were male. The general lack of law and order pervaded the whole area. Judge Rohrabaugh simply set off feelings that were already simmering. Public opinions was easily aroused against these people who looked different, spoke differently, worked cheap, and signs that appear on business that said Filipinos. There's a picture of that that was displayed in Stockton. Lack of leadership in the part of agricultural business were profiting and remaining silent about the abuse being suffered by their workers. The Filipinos were not unified in their efforts to improve their treatment by the growers, the law and order services, or the community at large. As Filipinos newspapers emerged, they began to play a critical role in defining and educating the Filipinos as a community with rights and power. The Filipino labor camp building, owned by the Bunn family, an agricultural family, was scheduled to be torn down. Fortunately, the Bunn family and the Yuki family, which were partners with the Bunn family, were advocates of agricultural history and offered the building to the Monterey County Historical Society. They offered to dismantle the building and reassemble it at the Monterey County Historical Society at the Veranda Adobe at their own expense. It was my privilege and honor on September 14, 2008, to dedicate the Filipino labor camp building in memory of the Filipino immigrants who played an important role in the agricultural history of Monterey County. The Filipino labor camp building is a symbol to those Filipino field workers and labor contractors who worked the fields of Monterey County. The building represents a historical footprint to let their children, grandchildren, and future generations acknowledge and appreciate that Filipino immigrants were part of the great agricultural history of Monterey County. And that's my presentation.
Your pictures.
Yeah.
There's a picture of the Filipino field workers after a day's work. This is the infamous short hoe, Filipino workers thinning lettuce. Like I said before, this short hoe was deemed illegal through the efforts by the United Farm Workers. Could be mainly because of the a lot of back problems that were incurred by the workers using the short hoe.
Excellent. Thank you, Al, for sharing that. And thank you for bringing in some of those amazing images too, that tell the story of Filipino workers in agriculture in the Salinas Valley. So thank you very much. Our next speaker.
Okay, wonderful. So I want to begin by acknowledging that I am located on the land of the Esalan. They're also known as the Ramasan. So before you begin to talk about migrants in agriculture in California, I think it's really important to be able to acknowledge the kind of agricultural system that we have in California. The success of California's agriculture is explained in various ways. Most people attribute the climate, water, land to its success, but from a global political economy perspective, which is kind of where my expertise is, I would explain it from the point of agrarian capitalism and the abundance of California's agricultural landscape actually can be attributed to two human sources. One, the skillful manipulation of organisms, soil, and water. And the next one, without which we wouldn't have the kind of California agriculture that we have today, is an abundance of cheap human labor. And it's mostly migrant labor. So agrarian capitalism for me is really important to be able to understand what has been going on with land and labor. And then the other thing I wanted to point out is that that as far as land is concerned, I'll talk about it in a little bit, but labor, which is mostly migrant labor, as far as the political economy is concerned, you commodify land and labor both. You transform nature and human activity into objects that can be bought and sold on the market. So wage labor is really fundamental to the success of California's agricultural success. Of course, this labor is both indigenous and migrant, and we're very dependent on it, but what is peculiar about it and significant about it is that it's a repetitive cycle of recruitment, employment, exploitation, and exclusion. The majority of the labor that we have has been non-white. It's included indigenous people, it's included Chinese, Japanese, Filipinos, Mexicans, Punjabis, Oaxacans, Vietnamese, Hmong, but even before we begin to talk about that, we have to acknowledge the backbreaking work of slaves from Africa, Blacks, and then we also have to acknowledge Eastern Europeans, and other Africans that have contributed to California's agriculture. So California's agriculture is not something that just grew magically. It grew on the backs of people from all across the world. I want to now focus on Punjabi foreign labor. And in this ethnic and racial rotation of labor, I want to remind people that labor is commodified not once, but again and again and again. And in this landscape, land also has been recommodified, but it's recommodified to be revalued to increase in price. Whereas labor is recommodified into a position of weakness. You find it today, you find it at any stage of California's agricultural history. So where did the South Asians that are currently living here come from? They came from a region that's called the Punjab, now divided between India and Pakistan. The first migrants arrived by boat around 1896, and in 1899 is when you begin to find Punjabis, or mostly Sikhs, that begin to settle in California, in the Stockton area, and in Northern California. Mostly they're Sikhs, there are some Hindus, Muslims, and other faiths as well. A lot of these folks that were migrating were formerly part of the British Army. And then when they came over, they were finding jobs in the railroad industry, in lumber, and especially in agriculture. So along with the Chinese, along with other kinds of migrant labor, Punjabis worked on the Western and Eastern Pacific Railways, and they constructed the 700-mile road between Oakland and Salt City, which is now Interstate 80. Those who migrated to the Sacramento Valley, they worked in crews, just as today migrant workers work in crews, and they were called the Hindu crews. They came from a background of farming in one of the most fertile valleys of the world, the Indo-Gangetic Plain, which is the breadbasket of South Asia. The climate and the terrain, the crops of the Punjab, kind of similar to California, which is why they have thrived here. They were considered eccentric dressers and experienced discrimination, as you will find in Larry's presentation and as you found in Al's presentation as well. The Immigration Act of 1917 dictated that Indian laborers were no longer able to enter the United States. India was listed as a country in the barred zone identified in the Act. And then the California Alien Law of 1913, revised in 1920, prevented migrants from owning and leasing their own land, making it difficult for those who made their living as farmers. So were these folks defeated with all of these obstacles that they faced? Not at all. They created strategies and communities around all of these discriminatory policies. The most interesting part of this history of South Asians is what we call the Mexican Hindu community. About 500 families that claim their heritage both from Mexican culture and from Sikh culture. Many of the men were unable to bring their family members from India, and they were forced to seek relationships in California. Most of them, the early migrants, were Punjabi. They married Hispanic women, and this has resulted in a new hybrid culture. And really recently I saw that there is a hybrid dance now, which is a combination of Mexican folk dance and Punjabi folk dance as well. They were prevented from owning land due to anti-Asian laws. So, and most of them had settled around the Yuba City and Imperial Valley areas. So you find these mixed marriages in people from about 3 generations or 4 generations. The earlier children had names like Maria Singh or Jose Rai, but are part of a survival strategy of essential workers in California. So you can see very creative, innovative ways of dealing with the obstacles that they face. Both cultures share a rural life and associated socioeconomic status. And what you normally found was sets of Hispanic sisters or female relatives married into the same Punjabi family, formed business partnerships, and formed joint households. Male friendships, female kinship became the structure of family life. So the 2 cultures experienced different rights under the law. Punjabi men were unable to legally own land, but the Mexican women were able to own land. And so normally the land, if it was bought from the wages of labor of these immigrants, they were owned by the Mexican women. But there was some gender discrimination in all of this as well. If a Mexican woman married a Punjabi man, she would then be ineligible for land rights. So, as I said, there were many creative strategies to get around this. Other than marriage, in intermarriage, men turned to white landowners, lawyers, judges to hold land for them or to honor verbal leases or what was called Benami arrangements. And Benam, Be means without, Nam, without a name, so unwritten arrangements. They also registered land in the children's name who were American citizens. And as they lived in community Sikh temples, the Gurdwaras became center of immigrant movement, primarily because 95% of immigrants were Sikh. Another aspect of this hybridity, this fusion, this restaurant had closed a few years ago. It was called Rasul's El Ranchero restaurant in Yuba City. And my comment on this was, it was Mexican food, but not quite. And I'm pretty sure the local population believed it was not quite Mexican. Okay, so Punjabi settled in the Sacramento Valley, in San Joaquin Valley, Imperial Valley. They owned orchards. They worked up and down the length of California. In Fresno, in the first slide that I had with women sitting in the strawberry fields, that's from women, Punjabis working in Fresno. They were considered to be very hardworking, reliable. 60% of Imperial Valley was owned by non-citizens by 1919, including some Punjabis, not directly, but indirectly. They were tenant farmers, and they ran 88% of all ranches, very similar to what we have today, where you would have people of Mexican heritage or south of the border heritage that run actually most of the big farms that we have. They were able to provide regular profit from land without supervision. But Punjabis weren't content to remain laborers. They started pooling money to lease land. They acquired capital. They had a good reputation. And
They were
currently, South Asians
seminar.
are rice farmers, wheat farmers, orchard owners. They do
You started to ask.
row crops.
I didn't know. So
We had an inauguration today, but long
Shy
before
hair.
Kamala Harris was on the scene.
His name is
The lead
Baggio.
sing sound, he's a Punjabi.
I wonder if he's related to Robert
He
Baggio,
became
who's married to,
the first Asian
Ro-
member of
Robert was
the
married
House of
to,
Representatives. So the first Asian Congress
Jeannie.
person is
Jeannie was
1956,
Alan's
57 through
She was
1963.
the.
And here's a very interesting story, and the
Looks
story
like him.
is that he
Like
had
his sister Robert, his name was Christy.
from Berlin,
As a
and he couldn't find
message Cynthia and asked her who he is.
Okay.
to farming, and then of course he turned to politics as well. So you will find these kinds of scenes wherever the little Punjabs all across India, but especially located in the Imperial Valley and the Yuba City area. You have some very successful farmers today. They are third and fourth generation, so this is 3 generations. The older person here is Didar Singh Bains, and he's considered to be the peach king. He supplies 2 dough, and his worth is about 50 million. Here are some other images. Punjabis comprise over 10% of the total population, and every time at Alba, when I go through food safety training, they show a little video, and most people don't realize that part of the video is of a Sikh farmer or Sikh worker, and he's speaking in Punjabi, which is now one of the official languages that California honors. So the population is quite big. Another area connected with agriculture that the Punjabis are connected with is our trucks. Look for them on the freeways of California. You will see all kinds of names, and you might recognize the Baines name. There are some Muslim farmers too. This particular farmer, he's in Northern California, and he specializes in wheat. And I'm not quite sure how much time I have left now. Let me stop this. Let me check on my time. How much time
You
do
can play it.
I should go ahead and play it?
Yeah, you have a few more minutes.
My nome é Davi Rai. Eu vivo aqui ਸਤਿ ਸ਼੍ਰੀ ਅਕਾਲ ਮੇਰਾ ਨਾਮ David Rai ਹੈਗਾ ਮੈਂ ਰਹਿੰਦਾ Yuba City, California. My name is Lal David Rai. I'm a 3rd generation farmer in Yuba City, California. I am 3/4 Punjabi and 1/4 Hispanic.
So you speak Spanish,
I do.
or should I say, do you speak Mexican?
I do that too.
You speak Mexican?
I speak Mexican. Mexican
Tell us what Mexican means.
means Mexican.
Okay, and that's how Punjabi is called.
They have their own language for everything.
And here you have this little Chota Punjab that the rest of the world is not aware of, right?
Correct.
It could be any street USA,
That's true.
right?
That's true.
And you've been here for what, 100 years, your family?
My family has been here. My dad, my grandfather came, I think, in 1906.
Well, that makes it over 100.
Yes.
And he came straight here or went elsewhere?
You know, I'm not sure if he came to Canada. You'd have to ask my mother.
But your father, you were born here.
I was born here. My father left India and he worked his way to New Zealand, to Fiji, from Fiji to Panama, from Panama. They came up Mexico through the jungle, and actually they started farming in Mexico, and they cleared the land, they started farming there, and then the Mexican government deported them, loaded them up in trucks at night, and took them to southern Mexico and deported them. And then they turned around and they walked through Mexico at night so they wouldn't be seen. They came to Mexicali. And then in Mexicali, they were able to find a coyote, which is a smuggler, and promised him so much per person, and he smuggled them into California.
Okay, I'm going to stop here and stop this, and let me see.
All right.
Say 1, 2.
Excellent.
Well, let's see. Hello.
And start taking some questions from the audience in the interest of time so that you have an opportunity.
It's taking me some time to stop share, so okay, I think I've got it. So I'd like to ask a couple of questions first to the participants, and the first one will be for Robina. And can you unmute Robina?
Sure.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. Yeah, you know, we're trying to emphasize Asian Heritage Month, so maybe you might say a few things about the impact of your presentation and relating to Asian Heritage Month, and maybe a little more about you know, an understanding of Southern Asians.
Okay, one of the things that Larry asked me to elaborate on is just a little explanation of what South Asia is. South Asia is part of larger Asia and the Pacific Islands. And as everyone knows, there's been immigration from all parts of Asia constantly, not just to North America, but around the world as well. So you find Chinese and Japanese in South America, you find them, you heard that people moved from India to Fiji to across the Pacific to come to the United States as well. So South Asia has 8 countries, all the way from Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Nepal, Bhutan, and Sikkim. So that's quite a lot of countries. People have migrated from all of these countries across the world. What impact does all of this migration in agriculture have in terms of Asian contributions to the rest of the world? It's an entangled history, and as we celebrate Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders, etc., as I started with my presentation, I said, we would not have California's agriculture considered to be very successful without the contributions of all kinds of migrants. And it's not just their labor, it is the things that they brought with them, the culture, the vegetables, the agricultural practices, etc. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Elle, could you have a comment about Asian Heritage Month and the impact that some of the things that you had discussed?
Well, the impact that I had was the acts of violence against Asians. I just don't understand it. First it was blacks, now it's Asians. So I just don't understand the, all this violence directed at the Asian community.
That's an interesting point. My take on this Asian Heritage Month and the significance of what we're trying to do here is we are Asians and we're a part of that immigrant story. And I think we talked about that, and the history of that story needs to be maintained and retold, because there's many people that really, are just absolutely shocked. Maybe it's sort of like the Tulsa information.
Exactly.
Just been buried. So that's a good segue. Does anybody else have any questions? You can unmute yourself if you want, if you have a question right now. I know one of the questions that was answered was asked about was how many people came back from the incarceration. It was 300 families left, 300 families from the Salinas Temple left, and only 50 families came back. Does anybody else have any other questions? I know I've kind of kept you longer than you want, but you're free to unmute and ask a question of any of the participants right now.
Well, I've got one thing to say here. I have this book here. It's called Becoming Mexipino. Can you see it up there?
Yes.
I picked that up about 10 years ago. And it's pretty interesting. And I can totally identify with it, because I am Mexican Filipino. So take note of it. Pick it up. You can get it on Amazon.
What's the name of the book?
It's called Becoming Mexipino.
Okay.
And it's written by I can't pronounce his name too well. Govera Jr. Rudy Govera Jr. This is really interesting. I found it.
Govera. Yeah.
Yeah, I found it great.
Rudy Govera.
Yeah. Christy, I had a question for you. You related to Robert Baggio?
Alfred is.
That's my nephew.
Oh, so you're older than him.
Quite a bit older.
Well,
Robbie lives up in Oregon.
Well, who's the one that died recently? I'm just curious.
That was my brother, Richard Baggio.
Oh, Richard. He's the one who was married to Jeannie.
That's correct.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah. Jeannie and Richard had six children.
Wow.
So
Robbie's my nephew, and I saw him at my brother's funeral.
Oh, interesting.
Yep.
Thank you for that. Anyway,
so I was going to ask Rabina about what do they call Mexicans and Hindus? There was a term you used.
Okay, there were several terms. They were just called Mexican Hindus, but the language, which was a mixture of Punjabi and Spanish, the way that the Punjabis pronounced it is Mexican. So not Mexican, but Mexican.
Mexican, okay.
Yeah.
I thought you said they were Mexidus.
And then also the way that we have Oaxacan gangs, and then you have the Southeast Asian people that work in certain parts of agriculture. These were called the Hindu gangs, the crews that they had. And that was the general term, although from all the Punjabis are Hindus, they're Sikhs, they are Christians, they are Muslims. But they were all called Hindus.
Any other questions that people might have?
Can I say something?
Jean? Yes, go ahead.
I just wanted to thank you all for sharing the stories. You know, it's interesting to hear these stories that, you know, much of which I didn't know anything about. And it's really important for us Asians to share our stories and to stand together so that we can, you know, have a voice and educate the community about our Asian perseverance and the hard work that we have contributed to the United States. So thank you all.
Thank you, Jerry. Any other comments or questions?
I just want to
I'm
say
going
thank
to-
you also to everyone. This was really an enlightening discussion, and I learned a lot. And it's really interesting to hear about all of these survival tactics, you know, that people have had to go through and in order to persevere, you know. And right now, yeah, I agree with Jerry. It's really important for us to you know, hang together and support each other, and also learn more about each other in the process. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, I put in the chat the, you know, if you care to, that's our website with a donate button, so you can go directly to it. Just click on that. And I'm gonna also post the ACE website, which is right there. So if you want to support Asian cultural experience, either by joining, which it's available on that website, or donate to us, there's that link there. So we would appreciate any support that you have. Any other comments or
Larry, thank
questions?
you for putting this together.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
That was
Larry.
I'll have to admit that
I did have one more question.
Sure. Go ahead.
I had a friend that was in the detention camps, and he related a story to me about the fact that they were real estate agents were purchasing land, agricultural land, because the owners couldn't pay the taxes while they were in the detention camps. He said he was fortunate because the neighbors had paid the taxes for him. What kind of impact has that, do you know, had on the farmers here locally?
Can I take a stab at that, Larry?
Go ahead.
So I had a friend that worked at the recorder's office. This is kind of related to what your question is. And there were two packing houses that bought up a majority of the foreclosed properties in, I think, 1943. And in 1946, my friend was looking at the property transfers, and one of the packing houses sold the land back to the Japanese that had them prior to the war, and the other packing house kept the land. So I think this illustrates that some people are charitable, I guess, and others are greedy. So, and that's a lot of what happened on the Monterey Peninsula, where my experience is, where the fishing industry, where the $20,000 boats were sold for $100 because someone saw a deal, and they would, you know, buy the fishing boat for pennies on the dollar. And you know, I'm not sure. Larry may have a better feel on. You know, prior to World War II, you know, Salinas was known as a salad bowl of the world for the number of vegetables that were shipped out to everywhere else. And over half of those crops were grown by Japanese farmers. So I don't know what the situation is after the war. I'm sure that it was still remained the salad bowl of the world, but it was no longer controlled by Japanese. So that'd be an interesting statistic to know. But that's my answer to your a little bit sideways on it, but that's my answer.
I can relate to like maybe three quick scenarios. One was when Al talked about the Bunn family. The Bunn family and the Yuki family were partners, and in addition to that, Yuki was 51% owner of the produce company that they had developed. And so when they were incarcerated, the Bunn family took care of it, and they probably made quite a bit of money during that time period as partners. I know that the Ikeda family was right there in Carr Lake, and the Madalora family farmed it for them. And then another incident in San Juan Bautista along Highway 156. There were quite a few Japanese families that there, and the Delormier family, who owned Monterey Bay at that time, farmed it for them and kept all their whatever profits they made. They gave it back to them and gave their farms back to them. They actually ran it for them. So I'm sure there was a lot of negative impact as well, but you probably don't hear about those stories quite as much.
Right. I think there was up in the Sacramento Valley stories of where the neighbor ran the farm, and it was so successful that he paid off the mortgage for the family and handed them the deed when they returned from camp. I mean, 3 years, that's maybe they didn't know that much, but still another example of the charity of some folks.
Yeah, we're going a little bit over, but I'm willing to hang on. If anybody has any other questions, you can go ahead and ask. If not, again, this is the conclusion of our Asian Heritage Month lecture series. We kind of put it together as a activity to keep the Asian heritage positions alive and well. So I appreciate all the people that came and hung in there for the entire time. So I really appreciate that. And so at this time, thank you very much. And the other thing that I just want to inform you on is that this is recorded. We're going to download it, edit it a little bit, and then put it on the Asian Cultural Experience YouTube channel. And also the Watsonville Riot lecture is already on YouTube. And then we're going to finish up with Amy Wu's. We're editing that now. We'll post that to YouTube, the Asian Cultural Experience YouTube. So, and for those who think, they can pass that on to their friends.
Well, Larry.
Anything else?
Larry, I want to thank you for organizing this presentation. Thank
You're
you.
welcome. I enjoyed it. It was.
Yeah, thank you, Larry.
Fortunately, it wasn't that difficult. So thank you very much.
You're too modest. All
It
right.
looked difficult. It looked difficult, Larry.
As long as my internet is fast enough and I know how to turn videos on and off, I'm okay. And I sort of did that. Thank you
Great.
all. I'm
Thanks.
gonna end the meeting.
Goodbye, Rubina.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rubina. Thank you, Al.
Thank you, Larry.